I thought it was just a casual family chat until my sister told me not to come to her engagement party. I smiled and nodded like the obedient sibling they expected. Then I walked out and made exactly one phone call. 15 minutes later, her phone started buzzing, and that diamond ring on her finger suddenly became the heaviest thing she would ever carry. My name is Stella Turner. I am 34 years old, and according to the people related to me by blood, I am a professional disappointment. We were sitting in a crowded coffee shop in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. It was 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, the peak of the morning rush. The air inside smelled of burnt espresso and damp raincoats. Outside, the gray sky pressed down on the city, turning the street into a blur of charcoal suits and urgent umbrellas. Inside, the noise was a wall of sound. Grinders whirred, milk steamers screamed. People shouted orders for oat milk lattes and double-shot cappuccinos with the desperation of soldiers needing fuel for battle. I liked this noise. I liked the chaotic energy of commerce and caffeine. It was where I usually thrived. But today, the atmosphere felt different. It felt cold. It felt clinical. Across the small, wobbly round table, my younger sister, Brielle, was holding her left hand up to the light. The diamond on her ring finger was large. It was a cushion cut, surrounded by a halo of smaller stones that caught the overhead track lighting and threw aggressive sparks of white fire. It was a ring designed to be seen from across a room. It was a ring that screamed status. It was lovely. I said. Brielle beamed, but it was a practiced smile. She tilted her hand this way and that, admiring the refraction. She looked polished. Her hair was blown out in soft waves that probably cost $200 at a salon that morning. Her beige trench coat was belted tightly, emphasizing a figure she worked hard to maintain. She looked like a woman who had won something. She finally lowered her hand and took a sip of her herbal tea. She did not drink coffee. Coffee stained teeth, and Brielle was very concerned with optics. She told me that Evan picked it out himself. She said he went to a private jeweler in Charlotte. She said the clarity was VVS1. She listed these specifications like she was reading a spec sheet for a luxury car. I nodded. I drank my black coffee. I waited. I knew this meeting was not just about the ring. Brielle did not meet me for coffee in the middle of a workday just to show me jewelry. She could have done that over FaceTime. She could have done that in the group chat she shared with our mother. No, there was an agenda here. I could see it in the way she kept adjusting her silk scarf. I could see it in the way her eyes kept darting to the door, as if checking for an escape route. Then came the pivot. Brielle cleared her throat. She placed both hands around her warm mug, anchoring herself. She said we needed to talk about the engagement party. I leaned back in my metal chair. I told her I was listening. I assumed she needed help with logistics. I was good at logistics. It was, after all, what I did for a living. Even if she did not understand it. Brielle started speaking faster. She said the party was going to be next Saturday. It was going to be at the country club. It was going to be a very specific kind of event. She used the word networking 3 times in 2 sentences. She explained that Evan was really pushing for a promotion at Blue Hollow Freight Partners. She said that making senior account manager was just the first step for him. He was eyeing a director position before he turned 35. She told me that the guest list was curated. It was not just friends and family. It was partners. It was investors. It was the upper management of Blue Hollow. I watched her face. I saw the tension in her jaw. She was building a fortress of words to protect herself from what she was about to say. Then she stopped. She looked at me. Her eyes were wide, blue, and terrified, but there was a steeliness behind them that I recognized. It was the same look our mother had when she was about to criticize my hair or my clothes or my life choices. Brielle said it. She said, "Stella, I do not think you should come." The cafe noise seemed to drop away. The grinders stopped. The conversations around us faded into a dull hum. I stared at her. I did not blink. I did not gasp. I just sat there, my hand still wrapped around my coffee cup, feeling the ceramic cool against my palm. I asked her to repeat that. I wanted her to say it again. I wanted to force the words out of her mouth a second time so she could hear how they sounded in the open air. Brielle flushed a delicate shade of pink. She looked down at her tea. She said she did not want me to come to the party. I asked her why. She sighed, a long, dramatic exhalation that suggested I was being difficult. She said it was complicated. She said this party was crucial for Evan. It was about image. It was about projecting success. I asked her if my presence projected failure. Brielle winced. She reached across the table as if to touch my hand, then pulled back. She said that was not what she meant. She said it was just that people would ask questions. They would ask what I did. They would ask who I worked for. I asked her what was wrong with what I did. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. She said, "Stella, be realistic. You do consulting. You work from your laptop. You help small companies with paperwork. It is fine. It is great that you are getting by. But Evan's bosses are serious people. They deal with multi-million-dollar logistics contracts. They are corporate heavyweights." I stayed silent. She continued, gaining confidence from my silence. She said she was afraid I would feel out of place. She said she was afraid someone would ask me about my career, and I would have to explain that I was still figuring things out. She said she did not want me to be embarrassed. I felt a cold, sharp laugh bubbling in my chest, but I suppressed it. I kept my face perfectly neutral. I asked her if this was her decision, or if Evan had asked her to do this. Brielle hesitated. She looked at the ring again. She said they discussed it together. She said they wanted the evening to be flawless. No distractions. No awkward conversations about gig economy jobs. Then she played her ace card. She said Mom agreed with her. I felt a slight tightening in my throat. Of course Mom agreed. Our mother, Diane, treated social standing like a religion. To Diane, a son-in-law with a title at a firm like Blue Hollow Freight Partners was the Messiah. A daughter who lived in a downtown apartment and refused to discuss the specifics of her income was a heretic. Brielle said Mom did not want to be embarrassed in front of successful people either. She said Mom thought it would be better if we just did a private family dinner later, just us, where we could be ourselves. I looked at my sister. I really looked at her. I saw a woman who was 31 years old, but still desperately seeking approval. I saw a woman who defined her worth entirely by the man standing next to her. I saw a woman who was so terrified of a single crack in her perfect facade that she was willing to cut her own sister out of the picture. But mostly, I saw a woman who had absolutely no idea who she was talking to them, to Brielle and Evan and Mom. I was Stella the drifter, Stella the vague consultant, Stella who was always busy but never seemed to have a boss or a designated parking spot. They saw my lack of corporate lingo at the dinner table as ignorance. They saw my refusal to brag about bonuses as a lack of achievement. They did not know. They did not know that Heartline Contract Systems was not a gig. They did not know it was a firm I founded 6 years ago. They did not know that I employed 40 specialized contract auditors and legal compliance officers. They did not know that I spent my days restructuring supply chains for companies that made Blue Hollow look like a lemonade stand. And they certainly did not know the most important detail of all. Evan Cole, Blue Hollow Freight Partners. I knew that name. I knew that firm. I knew them very well. In fact, 3 weeks ago, my team had finalized the vendor review for one of our largest clients, a manufacturing conglomerate based in Charlotte. We were the gatekeepers. We managed their entire supply chain legal framework. We decided who got the contracts. We decided who kept the contracts. Blue Hollow Freight Partners was currently servicing a shipping route for that client. It was a contract worth roughly $2 million a year. It was the crown jewel of Evan's portfolio. It was the reason he was up for that promotion. And I was the one who managed the renewal metrics. I looked at Brielle. She was waiting for me to argue. She was waiting for me to cry. She was waiting for the drama so she could tell Mom that Stella made a scene. I did not give it to her. I took a slow breath. I nodded. I told her I understood. Brielle exhaled, her shoulders dropping with relief. She smiled. A genuine one this time. She said she knew I would get it. She said she knew I would want what was best for her. She said she loved me, and she promised we would get brunch next Sunday. I told her brunch sounded fine. I signaled for the check, but Brielle waved me off. She said she would get it. She said she wanted to treat me. She pulled out Evan's credit card, a platinum card that she placed on the table with a little flourish. I stood up, I buttoned my coat, I picked up my bag. I looked down at her one last time. She was texting someone, probably Evan, probably telling him that the problem was handled. The sister problem was gone. The optics were safe. I told her to enjoy the party. I told her I hoped the networking went exactly as she hoped. She blew me a kiss. She said thank you. Stella. She said I was the best sister. I turned and walked toward the glass doors of the coffee shop. The noise of the grinders seemed to sharpen. The cold air from the street hit my face as I pushed the door open. It felt good. It felt clarifying. I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The rain had started to drizzle, a light mist that coated the city in silver. People rushed past me, heads down, phones out. I moved to the side of the building, under the awning of a dry cleaner next door. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up. My background was a simple black geometric pattern. No photos, no clutter, just business. I unlocked the phone and opened my contacts. I did not have to scroll far. I tapped on the search bar and typed a single name, Tessa Lane. Tessa was my chief operating officer. She was the person who executed my commands with surgical precision. She was currently back at the Heartline offices, likely reviewing the quarterly compliance audits. My thumb hovered over the call button. Brielle thought she had uninvited a guest. She thought she had removed an embarrassment. She thought she was protecting Evan's big night. She had no idea that she had just handed me the detonator. Inside that coffee shop, my sister was dreaming of a perfect life funded by a $2 million contract that relied entirely on the goodwill of a woman she was ashamed of. She judged me by my lack of a visible title. She judged me because I did not wear a lanyard with a corporate logo. She was about to learn a very painful lesson about power. Real power is not the title on your business card. Real power is not the size of the engagement ring on your finger. Real power is the ability to pick up a phone and silently dismantle a man's career while he is busy planning a party. I looked at the number on the screen. One call. That was all it would take. One call to initiate a vendor conflict of interest protocol. One call to flag a compliance risk. One call to trigger a termination clause that Evan Cole probably had not even read. I pressed the green button. I lifted the phone to my ear. The line rang once, twice. Tessa answered on the third ring. Her voice was crisp, professional, ready for orders. I took a deep breath of the wet, cold air. This was not just business anymore. This was a family matter, and I was about to RSVP. Tessa Lane was waiting on the other end of the line, her breath steady, her presence radiating the kind of professional readiness I paid her a significant salary to maintain. She did not ask why I was calling at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. She did not ask why I was standing on a rainy sidewalk instead of reviewing the quarterly projections. She simply waited. In that brief silence between the connection and my first command, my mind did not go to the anger I should have felt. It went to the cold, hard data. It went to the reality of who I was versus who my family thought I was. To my mother, and by extension to Brielle and Evan. I was Stella the wayward daughter. I was the one who had quit a stable junior paralegal job 6 years ago to play on my computer. In their eyes, I was a glorified freelancer, someone who scraped by doing odd administrative tasks for desperate startups. They imagined me sitting in pajama pants at 2 in the afternoon, formatting resumes or proofreading college essays for $50 an hour. They thought my lack of a corporate lanyard and a rigid 9-to-5 schedule was evidence of a lack of ambition. They were wrong. I was the chief executive officer of Heartline Contract Systems. I did not format resumes. I did not proofread essays. My company was a specialized firm dedicated to high-level supply chain optimization and vendor compliance auditing for mid to large-cap enterprises. I employed analysts, forensic accountants, and former corporate lawyers. We did not just read contracts, we dissected them. We managed vendor portfolios for clients that moved goods across 3 continents. My family saw me as the chaotic variable in their neatly ordered lives. They did not know that I spent my days imposing order on chaos valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. My mother loved to talk about my brother. He was 36, 2 years older than me, and worked as a vice president of finance at a regional bank. It sounded impressive. It came with a corner office and a reserved parking space. He wore suits that cost $1,000. My mother would sit at Thanksgiving dinner and beam as he talked about interest rate fluctuations and quarterly bonuses. Then she would turn to Brielle, the golden child, who worked in marketing for a fashion retailer. Brielle would talk about brand synergy and social media engagement, and my mother would nod as if Brielle were negotiating peace treaties. Then they would turn to me. The tone would shift. It would become soft, pitying, the voice one uses for a sick pet. They would ask if I had found any new projects lately. They would ask if I was making ends meet. I never corrected them. I never told them that my brother's bank was one of the smaller vendors in a portfolio I had audited 2 years ago. I never told them that Heartline Contract Systems had generated more revenue in the last fiscal quarter than my brother would earn in the next decade. I kept my mouth shut. I let them have their titles. I let them have their pride. But today, that silence had become a weapon. I thought about the man who was the cause of my sister's sudden desire for distance. Evan Cole, the senior account manager at Blue Hollow Freight Partners. Evan was a man who looked good on paper. He had the right haircut, the right degree, and the right handshake. He was ambitious. He was currently chasing a promotion that would put him in the executive tier of his firm. Brielle had told me that this engagement party was the key to that door. It was where he would charm the partners, show off his beautiful fiancé, and prove he was a man of stability and status. What Evan did not know, and what Brielle certainly did not know, was that his career was currently dangling by a very thin thread. And I was holding the scissors. Blue Hollow Freight Partners was a mid-sized logistics firm. They were decent, but they were hungry. 18 months ago, they had bid on a massive contract for one of my oldest clients, a heavy equipment manufacturer based right here in the Carolinas. It was a complex service agreement involving interstate shipping, warehousing, and just-in-time delivery protocols. My team at Heartline had overseen the request for proposal process. We had vetted the bidders, we had scored their financials, their safety records, and their operational capacity. Blue Hollow had won the bid by a narrow margin. They had secured a 2-year contract to handle the Eastern Seaboard distribution. The value of that contract was exactly $2 million a year. It was the biggest win of Evan's career. It was the account that made him a star at Blue Hollow. I knew this because I had seen his name on every single weekly performance report. I saw his signature on the compliance documents. I saw his email address on the change orders. For 18 months, I had watched Evan Cole operate from the vantage point of a god. I saw his on-time delivery rates. I saw his fuel surcharge calculations. I saw the minor disputes he settled and the ones he escalated. I knew him better through his spreadsheets than Brielle knew him through their dates, and for 18 months, I had said nothing. I had maintained a professional firewall. I did not mix family and business. As long as Evan delivered the service, I did not intervene. I did not tell my client that the account manager for their logistics vendor was dating my sister. I treated Blue Hollow like any other vendor in the database. I kept it clean. I kept it ethical. But Brielle had just shattered that wall. I replayed the conversation in the coffee shop, letting the memory burn through me one more time before I gave Tessa the order. I thought about the way Brielle had looked at me, her eyes pleading but her posture rigid. She had said she just wanted everything perfect. She had said I would understand. She was right. I did understand. I understood perfectly. By uninviting me, by explicitly stating that I was not welcome in their world of success, she had clarified the situation. She had drawn a line. She had declared that we were not, in fact, a united family unit. We were separate entities. And if we were separate entities, then the conflict of interest that I had been quietly ignoring was no longer a dormant issue. It was an active liability. In my line of work, optics were everything. Brielle had used that word. Optics. She was worried about how it would look if her underachieving sister showed up at a party for high flyers. Well, I was worried about optics too. I was worried about how it would look to my client if they found out that their independent contract auditor was allowing a vendor to retain a $2 million contract while that vendor was marrying into the auditor's family. It was a classic conflict of interest. Clause 14. Section B of the Standard Vendor Agreement. A vendor must disclose any personal relationships with the auditing firm. Evan had never disclosed it. I had never disclosed it because, until today, I had considered it a private matter, managed by my own professional discretion. But now? Now I had been formally excluded. I had been designated as an outsider, and an outsider has no loyalty. If I was not family enough to eat canapés at the country club, I was certainly not family enough to overlook a compliance risk. The irony was bitter and sharp. My mother and sister thought they were protecting Evan's future by hiding me. They thought my presence was the threat. They did not realize that my presence was the only thing protecting him. My silence was the shield. My willingness to be the supportive sister was the only reason Evan Cole was still billing $2 million a year to my client. They had thrown away the shield because they thought it was ugly. I remembered the moment, just minutes ago, when the realization had fully formed in my mind. We were still at the table. Brielle had just delivered her final, crushing excuse about Mom not wanting to be embarrassed. I had looked at her. I had forced my face into a mask of acceptance. I had nodded. I had smiled that weak, sisterly smile that made them feel comfortable. I let Brielle believe she had won. I let her believe that I was taking the hit, that I would go back to my small, insignificant life and let them shine. But inside, my brain had shifted gears. It had stopped being the brain of a sister and started being the brain of a CEO. I had looked at the engagement ring on her finger. It was beautiful. It was expensive. And it was paid for, indirectly, by my approval. I remembered picking up my coffee cup one last time. I remembered the weight of the ceramic. I remembered looking at the dark liquid, swirling it gently. I had set the cup down. I did it very slowly, very deliberately. I placed it on the saucer without making a sound. No clatter, no splash, just a silent, definitive placement. It was the physical equivalent of signing a termination letter. That was the moment I decided. That was the moment the sister died and the auditor took over. I was not doing this out of spite. That was what I told myself as I stood on the rain-slicked sidewalk. This was not revenge. This was governance. This was compliance. This was protecting the integrity of the supply chain. If Evan Cole was going to be my brother-in-law, I could not audit him. That was a fact. If Evan Cole was removed from the contract, the conflict disappeared. That was also a fact. There were two ways to solve a conflict of interest. You either removed the auditor or you removed the vendor. They had tried to remove the auditor. They had tried to push me out of the frame, but they forgot one crucial detail about the hierarchy of power in the corporate world. The auditor is the one who holds the pen. The auditor is the one who writes the report. You do not fire the auditor unless you have something to hide, and I had nothing to hide. Evan, on the other hand, was expendable. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the damp city air. The memory of the cafe faded, the face of my sister, relieved and condescending, vanished. The image of the ring dissolved. I was back on the sidewalk. I was Stella Turner, CEO. I spoke into the phone. My voice was calm. It was the voice I used in boardrooms. It was the voice I used when I told a CEO that his operations manager was embezzling funds. It was a voice that allowed for no negotiation. I told Tessa that I needed her to pull the file for Blue Hollow Freight Partners. I waited a beat. I could hear the clicking of her keyboard in the background. She was fast. She was efficient. She was everything my family thought I was not. I told her we had a situation. I told her that I had identified an undisclosed conflict of interest regarding the lead account manager at Blue Hollow. I told her the name was Evan Cole. I told her that effective immediately. We needed to initiate the vendor rotation protocol. I did not scream. I did not shout. I did not use profanity. I simply used the language of the contract. I used the language that Evan Cole lived by, and the language he was about to die by. I instructed Tessa to draft the termination notice. I told her to cite the integrity clause. I told her to make it standard, bureaucratic, and absolutely lethal. I told her to send it directly to Evan, with a copy to his vice president of sales. As I gave the instructions, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was the peace of alignment. For years, I had tried to live in two worlds, the world where I was a powerhouse and the world where I was a disappointment. I had tried to shrink myself to fit into their narrative. I had tried to be small so they could feel big. No more. If they wanted to treat me like a stranger, I would give them the professional courtesy of treating them like strangers. And in my business, strangers who posed a risk were eliminated. I finished my instructions. Tessa asked one question. She asked if I wanted to review the draft before she sent it. I told her no. I told her I trusted her judgment. I told her to execute it within the hour. I hung up the phone. I slid it back into my pocket. The screen was dark. The deed was done. Across town, in a glass-walled office that cost too much to rent, Evan Cole was probably laughing with a colleague. He was probably checking his watch, thinking about lunch. He was probably feeling very good about his life, his ring, and his future. He had about 10 minutes left of that feeling. I turned and began to walk down the street. The rain was coming down harder now, but I did not open my umbrella. I let the water hit my face. I walked with my head up. I walked with the stride of a woman who owned the pavement beneath her feet. My sister wanted a perfect party. She wanted a room full of important people who respected power and success. I was going to give her exactly what she wanted. I was going to show her what real power looked like, and I was going to do it without ever stepping foot inside the room. I had told Brielle that I needed 2 minutes. I had said it casually, tapping the face of my phone as if checking a low-priority notification, apologizing with a tight smile for the interruption. I told her it was a minor issue with a filing deadline. I told her I just needed to step outside to clear a quick hurdle so I could give her my full attention. She had waved her hand at me, a gesture of benevolent dismissal, already refocusing on her cuticle oil. She believed me because, to her, my work was a series of minor administrative nuisances. She believed that a crisis in my world meant a printer had jammed or a notary was running late. She did not know that 2 minutes was exactly the amount of time it took to decapitate a career. I was standing under the awning of the dry cleaner next door to the coffee shop. The rain was steady now, a cold, rhythmic drumming against the canvas above my head. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. The street noise was loud, but Tessa Lane's voice cut through it with the clarity of a church bell. Tessa was my chief operating officer, but that title did not quite capture her utility. Tessa was a bludgeon wrapped in velvet. She was the person I called when I needed a problem to stop breathing, metaphorically speaking. I kept my eyes fixed on the glass window of the coffee shop. I could see Brielle inside. She was checking her reflection in the back of a spoon. She looked happy. She looked secure. I spoke into the receiver. I told Tessa to activate the vendor rotation protocol. There was a pause on the other end of the line. It was not a pause of confusion. Tessa did not get confused. It was a pause of calibration. She was accessing the mental file for the protocol I had just named. Vendor rotation was a term we used at Heartline Contract Systems to describe a strategic culling. It was a sterile, bureaucratic euphemism. It sounded harmless. It sounded like rotating tires or changing air filters. In reality, it was a scorched earth policy used to sever ties with a service provider without initiating a messy breach of contract dispute. It was the corporate equivalent of a silent assassination. Tessa asked me to confirm the target. I said Blue Hollow Freight Partners. Tessa paused again. Slightly longer this time. She knew our portfolio. She knew Blue Hollow was a high-performance vendor. She knew they were servicing the heavy equipment manufacturing account, which was one of our top 3 revenue streams. She asked me if I was sure. She reminded me that their metrics were in the 98th percentile for on-time delivery. I watched Brielle inside the shop. She was taking a selfie with her coffee cup, angling her hand so the ring caught the light. I told Tessa that performance was irrelevant. I told her that the issue was structural. I said the words clearly. I said there was a conflict of interest. I could hear the change in Tessa's breathing. In our line of work, conflict of interest was the nuclear codes. It superseded performance. It superseded price. It superseded history. It was a compliance violation that could void insurance policies and trigger federal audits if left unchecked. Tessa asked for the specific nature of the conflict. I told her it was an undisclosed personal relationship between the lead account manager and the auditing firm's executive leadership. I told her the relationship compromised the integrity of the objective review process. Tessa did not ask who the executive was. She knew. She was smart enough to connect the dots. She simply asked how I wanted to proceed with the documentation. I gave her the instructions. I kept my voice flat, devoid of the rage that was currently heating the blood in my veins. I told her to draft a notice of termination for convenience. I told her to reference Clause 19 of the Master Service Agreement. Clause 19 was the exit hatch. It allowed the client to terminate the agreement with 30 days of notice, for any reason or no reason at all. It was the clause vendors usually skimmed over because they assumed they would never be fired if they did good work. I told her I did not want to cite performance failures. I wanted this to be clean. I wanted it to be administrative. I wanted it to be a business decision that could not be argued in court. Then I gave her the most important instruction. I told her to address the letter personally to Evan Cole. I told her not to send it to the General Legal Department. I told her to send it to Evan and to copy his vice president of sales, a man named Marcus Thorne. I knew Marcus. I knew that Marcus cared about exactly two things: hitting his quarterly quota and avoiding liability. When Marcus saw a termination notice citing a conflict of interest linked to his star account manager, he would not ask questions. He would panic. Tessa asked me if I wanted to review the language before it went out. I watched Betrayal wave at a barista, flashing that smile that she reserved for people who served her. I told Tessa no. I told her I trusted her to strip the language of any emotion. I told her I wanted it cold. I wanted it to read like an autopsy report. I told her she had 10 minutes. Tessa said, "Copy that." She said the letter would be in Evan's inbox before my coffee got cold. I ended the call. I stood there for another 30 seconds. I needed to reset. I needed to lower my heart rate. I adjusted my coat. I smoothed a stray lock of wet hair back behind my ear. I checked my reflection in the darkened window of the dry cleaner. The woman staring back at me did not look like a sister. She looked like a CEO who had just made a $2 million decision. I took a breath, composed my face into the mask of the supportive sibling, and walked back toward the coffee shop door. The transition from the cold, damp street to the warm, noisy interior was jarring. The smell of roasted beans hit me instantly. I walked through the crowd, navigating the maze of tables and laptops. When I reached our table, Betrayal was typing furiously on her phone. She did not look up immediately. She was frowning, her thumb moving in a blur across the screen. I sat down. I picked up my cup. The coffee was lukewarm, but I drank it anyway. I needed the bitterness. Betrayal finally looked up. She slipped her phone face down onto the table. She looked annoyed, but she tried to cover it with a veneer of concern. She asked if everything was okay. She said I had been gone a long time. I apologized. I told her it was just a client issue. I told her we had to reshuffle a schedule. I made it sound boring. I made it sound small. Betrayal nodded, her eyes glazing over. She did not care about my schedule. She was relieved that the interruption was over so we could get back to the main topic. Her. She leaned in, her elbows resting on the table, invading my space. She lowered her voice, adopting a conspiratorial tone. She said she wanted to explain a bit more about the party, so I would not feel bad. I told her to go ahead. She said that Evan was under a lot of pressure right now. She said that Blue Hollow was looking at their year-end numbers, and this promotion was not guaranteed. She said he had to be perfect. She said he had to look like a man who had no baggage. She looked at me when she said the word baggage. I held her gaze. I asked her if she thought I was baggage. She laughed, a nervous, tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. She said no, of course not. She said I was family, but family could be complicated. She said Evan's bosses were old school. They liked clean lines. They liked pedigree. She said Evan had told her that the partners at Blue Hollow were looking for leaders who could command respect. I took another sip of coffee. I thought about the email that was currently being typed on a server 3 miles away. I thought about the command I had just issued. I asked her if Evan felt confident about his position. Betrayal lit up. She said, "Oh, Absolutely. She said he was the golden boy. She said he brought in the manufacturing contract, and that was the biggest account in the branch. She said everyone knew he was the rainmaker. She said the partners were flying in from Atlanta specifically for this party. She said it was basically a coronation. I nodded slowly. A coronation. I looked at her phone lying face down on the table. It was a rose gold model in a clear case. It was silent. I looked at my own phone, which I had placed face up next to my napkin. I realized then that we were watching two different movies. Brielle was watching a romantic comedy where the hero gets the promotion and the girl. I was watching a disaster film where the meteor was already visible in the sky, and the characters were still worrying about their dinner reservations. Brielle kept talking. She started listing the menu for the party. She talked about the tuna tartare. She talked about the open bar. She said they had hired a mixologist who was going to create a signature cocktail named after Blue Hollow. She said it was going to be called the Blue Horizon. I almost choked on my coffee. The irony was so rich it felt sticky in my throat. I asked her what time the party was supposed to start on Saturday. She said 7 o'clock sharp. She said they had a strict timeline. Cocktails at 7, speeches at 8, the big toast at 8:30. I looked at the time on my phone screen. It was 10:14. Tessa was fast. If I knew her, she was already proofreading. She was checking the email addresses. She was attaching the formal PDF on company letterhead. Brielle paused. She looked at me with a sudden flash of something that might have been guilt, or perhaps just discomfort. She said she hoped I was not angry. She said she really did want me there in spirit. She said maybe I could send a card, or flowers. I looked at her. I looked at the way her silk blouse draped perfectly over her shoulders. I looked at the expensive blowout. I looked at the utter lack of awareness in her eyes. I told her I was not angry. I told her I was impressed. She frowned. She asked what I meant. I told her I was impressed by her focus. I told her it took a lot of strength to prioritize optics over family. I told her that was a trait that would serve her well in the corporate world. She narrowed her eyes. She was not sure if I was complimenting her or insulting her. She decided to take it as a compliment. She smiled. She said thank you. She said she was just trying to support Evan. My phone buzzed. It was a single, short vibration against the wooden table. I did not pick it up immediately. I let it sit there. Brielle glanced at it. She asked if that was my client again. I said yes. I said it was probably the confirmation I was waiting for. I picked up the phone. I unlocked the screen. There was a text message from Tessa Lane. It was short. It was professional. It was final. Draft complete. Reviewed and signed. Sending to recipient E, Cole and M, Thorne in 10 minutes. Hard copy sent via courier for arrival by noon. 10 minutes. I looked up at Brielle. She was checking her reflection in the spoon again. She was adjusting a stray hair. She was preparing to leave. I put the phone down. I told her that sounded like a lovely party. Brielle beamed. She reached out and patted my hand. She said she knew I would come around. She said she knew I was reasonable. I looked at the ring on her finger. The diamond caught the overhead light, flashing white and blue. 10 minutes ago. That ring was a promise. It was a symbol of a future built on a $2 million foundation. It was a ticket to a country club reception and a life of comfortable prestige. Now, it was just a rock. It was a piece of compressed carbon sitting on the finger of a woman who was about to find out that her fiancé was not a rainmaker. He was a liability. I looked at the ring, and for the first time in the entire conversation, I felt a twinge of genuine sadness. Not for me, and not really for Brielle, but for the sheer, brutal efficiency of what was about to happen. The ring sparkled. It looked heavy. I wondered if she would still be wearing it this time next week. I wondered if Evan Cole would be able to afford the payments on it when he was explaining to his vice president why he had lost the biggest contract in the firm's history because he didn't know how to read the conflict of interest clause. I smiled at my sister. I told her she should probably check on Evan. She looked confused. She asked why. I told her just a feeling. I told her big days were stressful. She laughed. She said I worried too much. I sat back in my chair. I folded my hands in my lap, and I waited for the 10 minutes to pass. The countdown had begun, and the silence at our table was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The phone on the table began to vibrate against the wood. It was a low, aggressive buzzing sound. It rattled the spoon Brielle had been using to admire her reflection. It shook the saucer of her herbal tea. It cut through the ambient noise of the coffee shop like a drill. Brielle glanced at the screen. The name Evan flashed in white letters against a photo of the two of them on a boat somewhere, tanned and smiling. She sighed. It was a sigh of performative exhaustion. She rolled her eyes slightly, a gesture meant to show me that being in high demand was a burden she bore with grace. She reached out and tapped the side button to silence it. She told me she was sorry. She said Evan was just obsessed with making sure the RSVP list was updated. She said he was a perfectionist. I said nothing. I just watched the phone. The screen went dark for exactly 3 seconds. Then it lit up again. Buzz, buzz, buzz. This time, the vibration seemed more urgent. It danced toward the edge of the table. Brielle frowned. She picked up her tea, looking annoyed. She said she had told him she was meeting me. She said she had told him it was a serious conversation about family boundaries. She said he should know better than to interrupt. She silenced it again. I took a sip of my water. My heart rate was steady. My hands were perfectly still. Inside my head, I was counting down the seconds. Tessa Lane had said 10 minutes. It had been exactly 12 minutes since I hung up. The email had landed. The server had processed it. The notification had popped up on a screen in the Blue Hollow offices. The phone rang a third time. This was not a text. This was a call. And this time, Brielle did not just silence it. She looked at the screen with genuine irritation. She said she had to take this. She said he would not call 3 times unless it was an emergency with the venue. She swiped the green icon and lifted the phone to her ear. Her voice was sharp, ready to scold. She said, "Evan, honey, I am literally sitting here with Stella right now. Can this wait?" I watched her face. I watched the exact moment the world broke. It started in her eyebrows. They were furrowed in annoyance, and then, in a split second, they shot up. Her eyes went wide. The color, which had been flushed from the heat of the shop, drained out of her cheeks so fast it looked like a magic trick. She did not say anything. She just listened. I could hear the voice on the other end. I could not make out the words, but I could hear the tone. It was high-pitched. It was frantic. It was the sound of a man who was watching a building collapse while he was still standing on the roof. Brielle made a small, choked sound. She said, "Wait, slow down." "What do you mean?" The voice on the other end barked something loud enough for me to hear the cadence. It was fast, panicked shouting. Brielle gripped the phone tighter. Her knuckles turned white. She said, "Terminated? What do you mean, terminated?" She looked at me. Her eyes were searching for an anchor, but I offered her nothing. I sat there like a statue. She said, "Evan, stop screaming. Read it to me. Read exactly what it says." There was a pause. Brielle was listening. Her mouth opened slightly. Her breath hitched. She repeated the words as she heard them. She whispered, "Conflict of interest?" She listened again. She whispered, "Immediate effect?" She listened one more time. She whispered, $2 million? The cafe around us did not stop. The barista called out an order for a skinny vanilla latte. The door opened and closed, letting in a gust of wet wind. But at our table, the air had been sucked out of the room. Brielle lowered the phone just an inch from her ear, as if it had become hot to the touch. She looked at the device, then she put it back to her ear. Her voice was trembling now. She asked who sent it. She listened. She looked at me. This time, the look was not confused. It was terrified. It was the look of someone who realizes the monster is not under the bed, but sitting across the table drinking tap water. She said, "Heartline Contract Systems?" She said the name like a question, like it was a foreign language she was trying to translate. Then she listened to Evan's response. Whatever Evan said next, it hit her like a physical slap. She flinched. She pulled the phone away from her ear as a loud voice, Evan's voice, screamed something about a meeting. She said, "Evan, wait, I am with her. I can ask her." But the line had gone dead. Evan had hung up. He had bigger problems than his fiancé right now. He had a vice president of sales named Marcus Thorne, who was likely standing at his desk, demanding to know why their quarterly projection had just dropped by $2 million in a single morning. Brielle stared at her phone. The screen was black. She tapped it, but it stayed dark. She looked up at me. Her hands were shaking. She placed the phone on the table, but she did it clumsily, and it clattered against the wood. She asked me what I did. Her voice was barely a whisper. It was thin and reedy. I looked at her calmly. I did not blink. I asked her what she meant. She swallowed hard. She said Evan just called. She said he was hysterical. She said Blue Hollow just got a termination letter for their biggest account. She said the letter came from a company called Heartline. She paused, waiting for me to speak. I did not. She continued, her voice rising in pitch. She said Evan told her that the letter cited a vendor conflict of interest. He said the letter claimed there was an undisclosed relationship with the executive leadership of the auditing firm. She stared at me. She was trying to put the puzzle pieces together, but the edges were too sharp. They were cutting her. She said, Stella. Evan asked me if I knew who Heartline was. He said the letter was signed by a Tessa Lane, but the letterhead... She stopped. She took a breath. She said, Evan said Heartline is the auditor. He said they control the contract. He said if Heartline says go, the vendor goes. She leaned across the table. Her eyes were wet. She asked, Do you work for Heartline? I corrected her. I said I do not work for Heartline. I said I am Heartline. Brielle froze. The information hit her, but it did not make sense. It did not fit with the narrative she had built for 30 years. Stella the struggler, Stella the freelancer, Stella the embarrassment. She shook her head. She said that was impossible. She said Heartline was a major firm. She said Evan talked about them like they were the police. He was terrified of them. I nodded. I said he should be. I said we were very thorough. Brielle looked at her engagement ring. She looked at me. The connection finally snapped into place. The wires touched, and the spark burned her. She said, You did this. She said, You just did this. Right now. While we were sitting here, I did not deny it. There was no point. The paper trail was already established. I told her yes. She gasped. It was a wet, ugly sound. She said, How could you? She said, That contract is worth $2 million a year. That is Evan's entire career. That is his promotion. That is our house. That is everything. She said, Why would you do that? She said, Because I uninvited you? You destroyed his life because of a party? I leaned forward. I placed my elbows on the table. I interlaced my fingers. I looked her dead in the eye. I told her she needed to listen to me very carefully. I told her this was not about the party. I told her she had sat there, in this chair, 10 minutes ago, and told me that optics were the most important thing to Evan's bosses. She had told me that they valued clean lines. She had told me that they did not want embarrassment. I told her that in my world, in the world where I signed the checks that paid for her lifestyle, a hidden relationship between a vendor and an auditor is the dirtiest optic there is. I told her that by removing me from the family gathering, she had defined our relationship. She had stated, clearly and unequivocally, that I was an outsider. I told her that outsiders do not protect insiders. I told her that if I was not family enough to stand in a room with Evan's boss and drink champagne, then I was certainly not family enough to risk my professional license to cover up Evan's conflict of interest. I said, You wanted separation, Brielle. You wanted to make sure there was no confusion about who I am and who you are. I pointed to the phone on the table. I said, I just gave you exactly what you asked for. I removed the confusion. I removed the conflict. Brielle stared at me. Her mouth was open. Tears were starting to spill over her lashes, running down her perfectly contoured cheeks. They were black with mascara. She said, But he is going to be fired. She said, His boss is calling an emergency meeting. Evan said they're going to blame him. He said they are going to think he hid something. I shrugged. A small, microscopic movement of my shoulders. I told her he did hide something. I told her he hid the fact that he was marrying the sister of the woman who held his contract in her hand. He hid it because he was arrogant. He hid it because he thought I was nobody. He hid it because he didn't think I had the power to do anything about it. I told her that was a failure of due diligence. I said, in my industry, stupidity is a fireable offense. Brielle began to cry in earnest now. It was not a pretty cry. It was a panic cry. She put her hands over her face. She was shaking. People at the nearby tables were starting to look. A woman with a laptop glanced over, concerned. A man in a suit frowned. Brielle sobbed. You ruined it. You ruined everything. She looked up at me, her face blotchy. She said, call them back. She said, Stella, please. Call them back. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you were just mad. Fix it. I looked at her. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity. No regret. Just a cold, clean sense of completion. I told her I could not do that. I told her the letter had been sent. The client had been notified. The clock had started. I told her that once a vendor is flagged for a conflict of interest, they go into a database. It is permanent. It is systemic. I said, you cannot unring a bell. Brielle, just like you cannot unsend an invitation. Her phone rang again. It buzzed angrily against the wood. Brielle looked at it. It was Evan again. She reached for it. Her hand trembling so bad she almost knocked over her tea. She stared at the screen. She looked terrified to answer. She knew what was coming. She knew the voice on the other end was not going to be the voice of a loving fiancé. It was going to be the voice of a man who was watching his future disintegrate and was looking for someone to blame. She did not answer. She pressed the side button. She sent him to voicemail. She looked at me. Her eyes were full of hate. It was a pure, distilled hatred that only siblings can generate. She said, I hate you. I hate. She said, you are jealous. You have always been jealous. You did this because you cannot stand that I am happy. I stood up. I picked up my bag. I buttoned my coat. I looked down at her. She looked small. She looked messy. The polished woman from 20 minutes ago was gone. In her place was a child who had broken a vase and was trying to blame the wind. I spoke softly. My voice was low, so only she could hear. I told her I was not jealous. I told her I was tired. I told her I was tired of being the punchline to their jokes. I was tired of being the secret they kept in the closet. I was tired of being the wallet they reached for when they needed help, and the stranger they shunned when they wanted to look important. I leaned down, bringing my face close to hers. I delivered the line that I had been holding back for 6 years. I said, Brielle, if I am such an embarrassment to you, then I have a solution. I said, from today, do not touch my work. Do not touch my money. Do not touch my reputation. I pointed to the phone one last time. I said, you wanted a life without me in it. You just got it. I turned around. I did not look back. I walked toward the door. The sound of Brielle's sobbing followed me, but it was faint, swallowed by the noise of the grinders and the chatter of the crowd. I pushed open the door and stepped out into the rain. The air was cold. It smelled of wet asphalt and exhaust. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text from Tessa. Recipient confirmed receipt. Evan Cole has replied asking for clarification. Marcus Thorne has replied asking for a conference call. I have declined both. Vendor access to the portal has been revoked. I typed back 2 letters. Okay. I put the phone away. I hailed a cab. As I sat in the back seat, watching the city blur past the rain-streaked window, I thought about the engagement party on Saturday. I thought about the champagne. I thought about the speeches. I wondered if they would still hold it. I wondered if the partners from Atlanta would still fly in to toast a man who had just cost his firm $2 million. I closed my eyes. I felt lighter. The bridge was burned, and the fire was beautiful. The rain had followed me from the coffee shop back to my office, but the view was different from the 22nd floor. Down on the street, the weather was a nuisance, a cold dampness that ruined shoes and dampened spirits. Up here, in the corner office of Heartline Contract Systems, it was just atmosphere. The gray sky framed the steel and glass of the Raleigh skyline. turning the city into a monochrome painting of industry and commerce. I sat behind my desk. It was a wide, slab-like surface of reclaimed walnut, devoid of clutter. No family photos, no knickknacks, just my laptop, a secure hardline phone, and the silence of a room that commanded authority. My personal cell phone sat on the desk surface. It had been vibrating intermittently for the last hour. First Brielle again, then Evan, then a number I did not recognize, which I assumed was Evan's office line, and then, at exactly 2 in the afternoon, the name Diane flashed across the screen. My mother. I let it ring 3 times. I used those few seconds to center myself. I breathed in the conditioned air of the office, smelling the faint scent of leather and ozone. I was not Stella the daughter right now. I was Stella the CEO. I picked up the phone. I answered with a simple hello. My mother did not say hello. She launched an assault. Her voice was a pitch I had not heard since I was a teenager coming home past curfew. It was a mix of fury and genuine, trembling fear. She screamed that I was out of my mind. She screamed that I was vindictive. She said I was destroying my sister's future because I was too sensitive to handle a little family honesty. She said, "Stella, Evan just called me. He is at his office. He says he is being pulled into a disciplinary hearing. He says he might lose his job. Do you understand what you have done?" I kept my voice low and even. I told her I understood perfectly. She did not listen. She plowed ahead, her voice cracking. She said this was the most selfish thing I had ever done. She asked how I could be so cruel to Brielle. She said Brielle had been crying for 2 hours. She said I was using some technicality to ruin a good man's career just because my feelings were hurt. She said, "You have to fix this. You have to call them back right now and tell them it was a mistake." I waited for her to stop to take a breath. When she finally did, I spoke. I did not defend myself. I did not raise my voice. I asked her a single question. I asked, "Mom, do you know what I do for a living?" The line went silent. It was not a thoughtful silence. It was a hollow, stumbling silence. It was the sound of a woman searching her memory for a fact that she had never bothered to file away. She stammered. She said, "Of course I know. You do consulting. You help people with their paperwork. You work on computers." I closed my eyes for a brief second. There it was, the indictment. For 6 years, I had built a firm that audited Fortune 500 supply chains. I had been featured in trade journals. I had spoken at industry conferences, and my own mother thought I was a glorified secretary. I opened my eyes. I looked at the rain hitting the glass. I told her that was incorrect. I told her that I ran a risk management firm. I told her that my job was to identify threats to my clients' financial and operational security. I told her that I managed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I told her that Evan Cole was a vendor on one of those contracts. My mother made a dismissive sound. She said, "So what? You help him. That is what family does. You do not fire him." I leaned forward in my chair. I spoke clearly, enunciating every syllable so there could be no mistake. I explained the principle of leverage. I told her that when a vendor has a personal relationship with the auditor, it creates a vulnerability. I told her that if Evan knew he was protected by family ties, he would get sloppy. I told her that sloppy vendors cause accidents. They cause delays. They leak data. Then I delivered the hard truth. I told her that she and Brielle had made it very clear that morning that they did not respect me. They did not respect my position. They viewed me as someone to be hidden away. I said, "Mom, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot treat me like a shameful secret in the evening and then expect me to be a professional savior in the morning." I told her that a man who disrespects the person holding his contract is a man who lacks judgment, and I did not do business with people who lack judgment. My mother's tone shifted. The anger evaporated, replaced by a desperate, bargaining wheedle. It was a tone I hated even more than the screaming. She said, "Stella, please, we can fix this. I will talk to Brielle. She will apologize. We will invite you to the party. We will put you at the head table. I will make sure Evan introduces you to everyone." She paused, waiting for me to be grateful. She said, "Just call your boss, or whoever you need to call. Tell them to reinstate the contract. We will make it right." I felt a coldness settle in my stomach. She still thought this was a transaction. She thought my professional integrity was something she could buy with a seat at a dinner table. She thought an invitation to a party I did not want to attend was equal in value to a $2 million liability. I told her no. I told her that the invitation was no longer relevant. I said, "This is not a family dispute anymore. Mom, the moment I signed that termination order, it became a matter of corporate record. The decision has been executed. The client has been notified. The system has updated." I said, "You cannot bake a cake to fix a compliance violation." My mother started to cry. It was a manipulative, weaponized weeping. She said I was cold. She said I had changed. She said I was choosing money over blood. I looked at the phone. I realized that the conversation was over. There was nothing left to say to Diane Turner. She was living in a world where feelings dictated facts. I lived in a world where facts dictated consequences. I told her I had to go back to work. I told her to tell Evan to read his employment contract very carefully. I hung up the phone. I sat there in the silence, listening to the hum of the server room down the hall. I felt drained, but also strangely light. I had just severed the last cord. A soft knock on my door broke the mood. It was Tessa Lane. My COO walked in without waiting for an invitation. She was holding a tablet, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. She looked serious. Not the usual business serious, but something else, something sharper. She walked over to my desk and placed the tablet in front of me. She said we had a problem, or rather, we had a confirmation. I looked at the screen. It was a log of user activity from the secure vendor portal. This was the digital gateway where our vendors uploaded their shipping manifests, their insurance certificates, and their invoices. Tessa pointed to a series of highlighted entries. She said she had run a preliminary scan of Blue Hollow's activity logs, just to be thorough for the termination file. She wanted to make sure all their invoices were downloaded before we cut their access. She tapped the screen. She said, "Look at the timestamps." I looked. The entries were dated 3 weeks ago, then again 10 days ago, then again yesterday. Tessa explained what I was seeing. She said that Evan Cole's user ID had attempted to access the Tier 4 data architecture. I frowned. Tier 4 was restricted. Tier 4 was not logistics. Tier 4 was client proprietary data. It contained the manufacturing schematics for the heavy equipment my client built. It contained future production schedules, patent-pending design specs, and raw material cost breakdowns. A logistics vendor like Blue Hollow had absolutely no reason to see that data. They only needed to know the weight of the crates and the destination address. I asked Tessa if he got in. She shook her head. She said no. Our firewall blocked him. He did not have the clearance, but he tried. And he didn't just try once. He tried 19 times in the last month. She swiped to the next page. She said it gets more interesting. She showed me a log of password reset requests and admin override attempts. Evan had been trying to brute force his way into a higher clearance level. He had been probing the system, looking for a weakness. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning. This was not just incompetence. This was not just a guy who was bad at his job. I looked up at Tessa. I said, "He wasn't just trying to do his job. He was mining." Tessa nodded. She said it looked like industrial espionage, or at the very least, a gross violation of the non-disclosure agreement. Why would a freight manager need the blueprints for a prototype turbine engine? I thought about the engagement party. I thought about the networking Brielle was so excited about. I thought about the important people Evan wanted to impress. And then a dark, ugly thought formed in my mind. Maybe Evan wasn't just trying to climb the ladder at Blue Hollow. Maybe he was looking for a golden parachute. Or maybe he was planning to sell something to a competitor. The conflict of interest I had cited in the termination letter was real. But it was benign compared to this. I had fired him because he was family. But now, looking at these logs, I realized I might have inadvertently stopped a data breach. I looked at Tessa. The air in the room shifted. It was no longer just about a contract termination. It was about a crime. I gave my next order. I told Tessa to widen the scope. I told her to pull everything. I wanted every email Evan Cole had ever sent to our system. I wanted every quote he had submitted. I wanted to see the metadata on every file he had uploaded. I told her to contact the compliance team at the client's headquarters. I wanted them to run a cross-reference on Evan's name against their visitor logs and their internal security blasts. Tessa's eyes widened slightly. She asked if I wanted to alert legal yet. I said not yet. I said we needed to build the bomb before we dropped it. I told her to look for patterns. I wanted to know if he was sharing this access with anyone else. I wanted to know if anyone from Blue Hollow's upper management knew he was rattling the doorknobs of the secure server. Tessa nodded. She took the tablet back. She looked at me with a new level of respect. She did not know the family drama. She did not know about the engagement party. She just knew that her CEO had an instinct that was frighteningly accurate. She turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. I stood up. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window behind my desk. The city of Raleigh was spread out below me, gray and wet and busy. Somewhere out there, Evan Cole was sitting in a meeting, sweating through his expensive shirt, trying to explain why he lost $2 million. He probably thought it was personal. He probably thought I was just a bitter sister-in-law getting revenge. He had no idea. He did not know that he had just handed me the weapon that would not just end his job, but potentially end his freedom. I placed my hand against the cool glass. My mother had asked me if I knew what I was doing. She had accused me of destroying Brielle's future. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I was not destroying Brielle's future. I was saving her from marrying a man who was either a criminal or a fool. I watched the cars moving like toys on the highway below. I whispered to the empty room. I said, "You wanted to play in the big leagues, Evan." I watched a drop of rain trace a path down the window pane. I said, "Welcome to the game." The afternoon light in the conference room had turned a bruised purple as the sun dipped behind the Raleigh skyline. But inside Heartline Contract Systems, the fluorescent lights were humming with the harsh brightness of an operating theater. We were performing surgery on the digital corpse of Blue Hollow's account history. Tessa Lane sat to my right, her fingers moving rhythmically across her keyboard, across the table. The head of my internal compliance unit, a man named David who treated every irregularity like a personal insult, was projecting documents onto the smart glass wall. David did not look happy. He pointed to a series of email chains that had been flagged by our archival software. He said that he wanted me to look at the pattern of requests starting about 4 months ago. I leaned back in my chair, studying the projection. The emails were from Evan Cole. On the surface, they looked like standard account management check-ins. He was asking about delivery windows, loading dock protocols, and insurance liability caps. It was boring, routine logistics chatter. But then David highlighted a paragraph in yellow. He asked me to read the third sentence. I read it. It was an email from Evan to one of our junior logistics coordinators. He wrote that Blue Hollow was looking to expand their service suite and offer strategic consulting on inventory flow. He suggested that to give us a better quote. He would need to see the long-term production forecast for the upcoming fiscal year. I felt a muscle in my jaw tighten. A logistics hauler does not need long-term production forecasts. They need to know how many boxes are leaving the dock next week. Asking for the production forecast was like a valet driver asking for the blueprints of the engine. David scrolled down. He showed me another email, dated 2 weeks later. This one was more specific. Evan had asked if there were any special security protocols needed for the upcoming factory events in October. I froze. The factory events in October were not public knowledge. My client, the manufacturing conglomerate, held an annual closed-door summit for their top-tier investors and military contractors. It was where they unveiled their prototypes. It was where they showed off the technology that would not be on the market for another 5 years. The dates of that summit were classified. The location was secure, and the very existence of the special prototypes was covered by a non-disclosure agreement that was thick enough to stop a bullet. I looked at David. I asked him if anyone had replied to Evan. David shook his head. He said the junior coordinator had ignored it. probably thinking it was just noise, but the point was not the reply. The point was the ask. Evan Cole had gone fishing. He was casting lines into deep water, hoping someone would slip up and hand him a map to the treasury. I looked at the timestamps again. These emails coincided perfectly with the weeks leading up to his promotion review. I realized then that Evan was not just trying to be a good employee. He was trying to build a dossier. He wanted to walk into his partner meeting not just with a shipping contract, but with inside information on one of the biggest manufacturers in the country. He wanted to be the guy who knew what the client was building before the client announced it. It was reckless. It was unethical. And it was exactly the kind of behavior that got firms like mine sued into oblivion if we did not catch it. I gave the order. I told David to draft an internal incident report. I told him to label it as a Level 3 security anomaly. I told him to seal the data. I wanted a complete lockdown on any file that Evan Cole or anyone from Blue Hollow had ever touched. I wanted their vendor access terminated not just on the active portal, but on the archive server as well. I told him to restrict all communication. No one in my firm was allowed to speak to anyone at Blue Hollow without legal counsel present. David nodded and left the room to execute the lockdown. Tessa and I remained in the silence of the conference room. She looked at me. She did not say anything, but she did not have to. We both knew that we had moved past the realm of a bad breakup and into the realm of corporate espionage. My personal phone vibrated on the mahogany table. It sounded loud in the quiet room. I looked at the screen. It was Brielle. I had not spoken to her since I walked out of the coffee shop that morning. The screen showed a notification for a text message. It was long. It took up the entire preview window, and I had to unlock the phone to read the rest. I picked it up. Brielle wrote that she had stopped crying. She wrote that she had been thinking. She wrote that she wanted to explain properly without Evans screaming in the background. She wrote that I had to understand the pressure she was under. She said that being with a man like Evan meant living in a world of high expectations. She said that the people in his circle were successful, aggressive, and judgmental. She said she felt small around them. She said she uninvited me not because she was ashamed of me, but because she was afraid of them. She said she just wanted one night where she didn't have to worry about explaining my unconventional career path to people who judged worth by job titles. She ended the text with a plea. She said she was sorry she hurt my feelings, but I had to understand that this punishment did not fit the crime. She begged me to reverse the decision before it became permanent. I read the text twice. I analyzed it the way I analyzed a contract. I looked for the clauses of accountability. I looked for the admission of liability. I found none. She was apologizing for her stress, not her actions. She was blaming the atmosphere of success for her decision to treat her sister like a peasant. She was still, even now, operating under the delusion that I was the one who didn't fit in, rather than realizing that her fiancé was the one who was unfit. I typed my reply. I did not use emojis. I did not use soft language. I wrote, "Are you sorry because you misunderstood who I am, or are you sorry because you are suffering the consequences of that misunderstanding?" I hit send. I did not wait for a response. I put the phone down. 10 minutes later, the office intercom buzzed. It was my receptionist, Sarah. She said there was a Mr. Cole in the lobby. He did not have an appointment. I looked at Tessa. She raised an eyebrow. Sarah said that Mr. Cole was asking for 5 minutes. She said he claimed it was a personal family emergency. I pressed the button on the intercom. I told Sarah to let him in, but I told her to escort him to conference room B. I told her not to bring him to my office. I looked at Tessa. I told her to grab her notepad. I told her I wanted her in the room. Tessa stood up. She smoothed her blazer. She looked ready for a fight. We walked down the hall to conference room B. It was a glass-walled room near the elevators, visible to the entire floor. I wanted him to be seen. I wanted him to know that there were no shadows here. When we entered, Evan was standing by the window, looking out at the rain. He turned when the door opened. He looked different than the photo on Brielle's phone. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a frantic, sweaty energy. His tie was slightly loosened. His hair, usually gelled into submission, was a little wild. He tried to smile. It was a terrible, jagged attempt at charm. He said, "Stella." "Hi. Thanks for seeing me." He stepped forward, extending a hand as if we were meeting for drinks. I did not take his hand. I walked to the head of the table and sat down. I gestured for Tessa to sit next to me. I told him to sit down. Evan lowered his hand. He looked at Tessa, then at me. He asked if we could do this one-on-one. He said it was a family matter. I told him it was not a family matter. I told him that he was here to discuss the termination of a master service agreement held by Heartline Contract Systems. I told him that Tessa was my witness and the recording officer for this meeting. Evan stiffened. He sat down slowly, pulling the chair out with a screech against the floor. He cleared his throat. He said, "Look, Stella, I know you're upset about the party. Brielle told me everything. It was a miscommunication. We were stressed. We made a bad call." He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He said, "But let's be adults here. You cannot torch a $2 million deal over a wedding invite. My bosses are climbing the walls. They are talking about legal action. They are talking about audits." I looked at him. I kept my face blank. I told him that his bosses were right to talk about audits. Evan blinked. He shifted in his seat. He said, "Come on. I am willing to renegotiate the terms if that is what you want. We can drop our rates by 2%. We can extend the payment terms. I can make this look like a win for you." He was trying to bribe me. He was trying to bribe me with my own client's money. I told him that the contract was not up for negotiation. I told him it was terminated for cause. Evan's face hardened. The charm evaporated. The desperation curdled into something uglier. He said, "You know, people talk in this town. Raleigh is not that big." He sat back, crossing his arms. He said, "If this goes through, if I lose this job, people are going to ask why. And when I tell them that my fiancé's sister used her professional position to settle a petty personal grudge, well, that is not going to look good for Heartline." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. He said, "They will say you are emotional. They will say you are vindictive. They will say you cannot separate your personal life from your business. That scares clients." Stella. I felt a cold smile touch my lips. It was the first time I had smiled all day. I looked at Tessa. She was writing down every word he said. I looked back at Evan. I told him that he was welcome to tell anyone whatever story he liked. I said, "But rumors are expensive, Evan, and facts are free." I leaned forward. I said, "My reputation is not bought with dinner parties. It is bought with accuracy. And the fact is, you have an undisclosed conflict of interest. The fact is, you failed to report it. The fact is, you are a liability." I said, "People can say I am mean. They can say I am a witch. I do not care, but they will never say I am incompetent." Evan stared at me. He realized that his threat had bounced off me like a pebble off a tank. He stood up abruptly. He grabbed his briefcase. He said, "You are going to regret this. You are destroying your family for nothing." He turned to the door. He put his hand on the handle. Then, he stopped. He looked back at me, his eyes narrowing with a sudden, spiteful thought. He wanted to hurt me. He wanted to prove that he knew things. He wanted to show me that he was not just some ignorant vendor, but a player who had been on the inside. He said, "You think you are so smart, holding all the cards. But I know about the delays on the Chimera project." The room went dead silent. My heart did not speed up. It stopped. The Chimera project. That was the internal code name for the prototype turbine my client was building. It was the special prototype that was going to be unveiled at the October summit. The name Chimera existed in exactly one place, the Tier 4 secure data folder. It was not in the logistics manifest. It was not in the shipping emails. It was not on any document that Evan Cole should have ever seen. For him to know that name, he had to have seen the file. He had not just rattled the doorknob, he had picked the lock. Evan saw the look on my face. He thought he had scored a point. He smirked, thinking he had unsettled me by showing off his knowledge. He said, "Yeah, I know they are 3 months behind on the rotor assembly, So do not act like you are the only one who knows what is going on." He opened the door and walked out. I sat there, frozen. Tessa stopped writing. She looked up at me. Her face was pale. She whispered, "Did he just say chimera?" I nodded slowly. I said, "Yes, he did." I stood up. My legs felt steady, grounded by the weight of the new reality. I said, "He just confirmed it." I walked to the glass wall and watched Evan Cole walking down the hallway toward the elevators. He was walking fast, angry, thinking he had just delivered a stinging parting shot. He did not know that he had just signed his own death warrant. He had just confessed, in front of a witness, to accessing classified trade secrets that were protected by federal law. He had just admitted that he had breached the firewall. I turned to Tessa. I told her to call legal. I told her to call the client's security officer. I said, "We are not just terminating the contract anymore." I looked at the empty doorway where Evan had stood. I said, "We are filing charges." I did not go home immediately after Evan left. I could not. My apartment was a sanctuary of silence, and right now, my mind was too loud for silence. I needed answers, and I needed them from the source. I ordered Tessa to lock down the office. I told her to initiate the digital forensic sweep we had discussed. Then I picked up my phone and dialed my sister. I did not ask her if she was free. I did not ask her if she was still crying. I gave her an address. It was not my apartment, and it was certainly not the country club. It was a small, 24-hour diner near the University District. It was a place with fluorescent lights, sticky tables, and zero atmosphere. It was neutral ground. It was a place where no one would care if we raised our voices or if a woman in a designer coat had a breakdown. I told her to be there in 20 minutes. I arrived first. I ordered a black coffee. I watched the rain streak against the plate glass window. The diner was mostly empty, populated only by a few students studying late and a truck driver eating pie at the counter. When Brielle walked in, she looked like a ghost of herself. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, messy bun. Her eyes were red and swollen. She was wearing a tracksuit, having shed the polished armor of the morning. She looked young. She looked vulnerable. But I could not afford to see her vulnerability. I could only see the leak. She slid into the booth opposite me. She did not say hello. She just looked at her hands, which were clenched together on the tabletop. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I asked her a single question. I asked, "How much did you tell him?" Brielle looked up, startled. She blinked, her lashes wet. She asked what I meant. I leaned forward. The table was small, forcing an intimacy neither of us wanted. I told her that Evan had just walked out of my office. I told her that in a desperate attempt to prove he was smarter than me, he had mentioned a project code name. I said the name, Chimera. I watched her face carefully. I was looking for a flicker of recognition. I was looking for the tell. Brielle's eyes widened slightly, then shifted to the left. It was a subtle movement, but to a trained observer, it was a confession. I continued. I told her that the Chimera Project was a classified initiative. I told her that the name alone was protected by a non-disclosure agreement that carried federal penalties. I told her that Evan knew about the production delays. I asked her again. I asked how he knew that. Brielle started to stammer. She said she did not know. She said maybe he heard it at work. She said maybe he guessed. I stopped her. I slammed my hand down on the table. It was not a loud bang, but the vibration made the silverware jump. I told her to stop lying to me. I told her that Blue Hollow had zero access to that information. I told her that the only place that information existed outside of the secure server was in my head, and occasionally, in the conversations I thought were private. I looked at her. I replayed the last 6 months of our interactions in my mind. I scanned them like a transcript. I remembered a lunch we had 2 months ago. It was a rare occasion where Brielle had seemed interested in my work. She had asked me about my stress levels. She had asked me what the biggest nightmare on my desk was. I had been touched. I had thought she cared. I had vented. Just a little. I had mentioned a turbine project that was behind schedule. I had mentioned the code name because it sounded cool, and I thought it was harmless gossip between sisters. I felt a cold sensation wash over me. I asked her if she remembered that lunch at the Italian place. Brielle flinched. She pulled her hands into her lap. I asked her if she told Evan about that conversation. Brielle began to cry again. It was a soft, miserable sound. She said, "I didn't mean any harm. Stella, I swear." She said, "We were just talking at dinner that night. Evan was stressed about his numbers. He was saying he needed an edge. He said he needed to show his bosses that he understood the client's pain points." She looked at me, pleading. She said, "I just wanted to help him." I said, "Oh, Stella mentioned this big project called Chimera that is stuck in production. I thought it would just help him write a better email. I thought it would make him look smart." I stared at her. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. I asked her if she understood what she had done. I told her she had taken a confidential client secret, something I was legally bound to protect, and she had handed it to a vendor like a party favor. She sobbed. She said, "I didn't know it was illegal. I just thought it was work talk." Then came the twist, the knife that went deeper than I thought possible. Brielle wiped her nose with the back of her hand. She looked down at the table, her voice shaking. She said, "Besides, Mom said it was okay." The world stopped. The hum of the refrigerator unit in the corner seemed to vanish. I repeated the words. "Mom said it was okay." Brielle nodded. She sniffled. She said, "Mom told me to do it. She said, a few months ago, when Evan started talking about the promotion, Mom took me aside. She said that if I wanted to be the wife of a successful executive, I had to help him. She said I was your sister, so I had access." Brielle looked up at me, her eyes wide and guileless. She said, "Mom told me to ask you questions. She said you like to complain about work if we let you. She said I should just let you talk, remember the details, and then tell Evan so he could use it to bond with the client. She said, she called it, helping the family get ahead." I sat back in the booth. I felt physically ill. The fluorescent light suddenly felt too bright, searing my retinas. It was not just Brielle. It was not just a thoughtless sister trying to impress her boyfriend. It was an operation. My mother, the woman who claimed to be so ashamed of my career that she hid me from the guest list, had been actively mining that career for assets. She had turned my sister into a spy. She had weaponized our family dinners, every time they had asked, "How is work?" It had not been love. It had been extraction. They looked down on me. They mocked me. They treated me like the family failure. But they were perfectly happy to steal from me if it meant helping the real success story. Evan Cole. I looked at Brielle. I saw her clearly now. She was not malicious. She was just a tool. She was a hollow vessel that my mother and Evan had filled with their own ambitions. I asked her if she realized how sick that was. I asked her if she realized that they had used me. Brielle shook her head frantically. She said, "No, Stella. It wasn't like that. We just wanted Evan to succeed. Mom said since you were not using the connections to get rich, someone in the family should—" I laughed. It was a dry, harsh sound that made the truck driver at the counter turn his head. I said, "Since I wasn't using them?" I said, "Brielle, I own the company. I am the connection." Brielle reached across the table. She tried to take my hand. I pulled it away. She said, "Please, Stella, don't be like this. Mom was just trying to look out for us. She didn't think it would hurt you. She said you wouldn't even know." I looked at her hand, hovering in the empty space between us. I told her that was the problem. They never thought about whether it would hurt me, because they never thought about me as a person who could be hurt. I was just a resource. I was an ATM that dispensed information instead of cash. My phone rang. It was on the table between us. The screen lit up. It was Mom. I looked at Brielle. I asked her if she had texted Mom. Brielle nodded guiltily. She said she was scared. She said she texted Mom that I was really angry and that I knew about the leak. I picked up the phone. I put it on speaker. I wanted Brielle to hear this. I said, "Hello, Mom." My mother's voice filled the small booth. It was shrill, breathless, and defensive. She said, "Stella? Brielle says you are interrogating her. What is going on?" I told her I was not interrogating her. I was debriefing a witness. I told her Brielle just told me about your little strategy. I told her I knew that she had instructed Brielle to pump me for confidential trade secrets to feed to Evan. There was a pause on the line, a beat of hesitation. Then, my mother shifted tactics. She did not deny it. She minimized it. She said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, Stella, you are making it sound like we stole nuclear codes. It was just a little business gossip. Everyone does it," she said. "You are making a mountain out of a molehill. Evan just needed a leg up. You should be happy to help your brother-in-law." I felt the anger rising in my chest, hot and suffocating. I asked her if she knew that what she called gossip was a federal crime. I asked her if she knew that by encouraging this, she had exposed Evan to a lawsuit that would bankrupt him. My mother scoffed. She said, "Stop being so dramatic. You always have to be the victim. It is just a job. Stella, it is not the CIA." She said, "Listen to me. You are going to stop this nonsense. You are going to reinstate that contract. And you are going to apologize to Brielle for scaring her. This is family. We help each other." I looked at Brielle. She was watching the phone, her face pale. She was waiting for me to cave. She was waiting for the dynamic to return to normal, where Mom commanded and I obeyed. I took a deep breath. I spoke into the phone. My voice was loud enough to carry, firm enough to cut glass. I said, "Mom, you keep saying this is a small thing. You keep saying I am overreacting." I said, "It is small to you because the person being sacrificed is not you." The line went silent. I continued. I said, "You were willing to risk my license, my reputation, and my company, just so Evan could sound smart at a cocktail party. You were willing to burn my hard work to keep him warm," I said. "That is not helping family. That is cannibalism." My mother started to sputter. She said, "How dare you?" I cut her off. I said, "I am done. Mom," I said, "I am not fixing this. I am not reinstating the contract. And I am certainly not apologizing," I said. "You wanted Evan to have a story to tell? Well, now he has one. He can tell everyone how he lost his job because he listened to his mother-in-law instead of his lawyer." I hung up the phone. I did not just end the call. I turned the phone off completely. I looked at Brielle. She was staring at me. Her mouth was slightly open. She looked shocked, not because of what I had said, but because I had said it. For 34 years. I had been the peacekeeper. I had been the one who swallowed the insults. I had been the one who fixed things. Tonight, I had broken it, and I had left the pieces on the floor. Brielle whispered, "You really aren't going to fix it, are you?" I shook my head. I said, "No," I said, "you are living by someone else's yardstick. Brielle, you are measuring your life by Evan's title and Mom's approval, and you are making me pay the price for it." I stood up. I threw a $20 bill on the table for the coffee I had not touched. I told her I was leaving. I told her she should probably go home and ask Evan exactly what else he had stolen, because my forensic team was going to find it anyway. Brielle looked up at me. Her eyes were dry now. The panic had been replaced by a strange, dawning realization. She was looking at me, really looking at me. For the first time in her life, she saw the coat I was wearing. It was tailored. It was expensive. She saw the way I held myself. She saw the absolute, terrifying resolve in my eyes. She realized then that I was not the sister who failed. I was the sister who had outgrown them. She whispered, "Stella, what are you going to do?" I looked down at her. I said, "I am going to do my job." I walked out of the diner. The rain had stopped. The air was cold and clean. I did not feel guilty. I did not feel sad. I felt like someone who had finally evicted squatters from her own house. I walked to the curb and raised my hand for a taxi. The family drama was over. The legal war was just beginning, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly which side I was on. The notification light on my secure desk phone blinked red. It was a solid, unblinking crimson that meant only one thing. The client was on the line, and they were not calling to wish me a happy Wednesday. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning. I picked up the receiver. It was the Chief Information Security Officer of the manufacturing conglomerate, a man named Henderson who had the personality of a concrete wall and the investigative instincts of a bloodhound. He skipped the pleasantries. He told me that their internal intrusion detection system had flagged a series of anomalous pings originating from the vendor portal assigned to Heartline Contract Systems. He said the pings were trying to bridge the gap between the logistics tier and the research and development tier. He asked me if I was aware that one of my subcontractors was trying to knock down the door to the Chimera project. I did not lie. I did not stutter. In the world of high-stakes compliance, the cover-up is always worse than the crime. I told him yes. I told him that my internal audit team had identified the breach yesterday afternoon. I told him that the user ID belonged to the senior account manager at Blue Hollow Freight Partners. I told him that the individual's access had been revoked. The account had been frozen, and the contract had been terminated for cause effective immediately. Henderson was silent for 5 seconds. In those 5 seconds, the fate of my company hung in the balance. If he thought I was complicit, or even just negligent, he could pull the entire Heartline account. I would lose not just $2 million, but the entire portfolio. He finally spoke. He said he appreciated the speed of the termination. He said he wanted a full forensic report on his desk by Friday. He said he wanted to know exactly what the user saw before the door was slammed shut. I promised him he would have it. I promised him that operational continuity would be maintained. I told him that not a single truck would miss a shipment during the transition. I hung up. My hands were sweating, but my voice had remained steady. Tessa Lane was standing in the doorway. She had heard the one-sided conversation. She knew how close the bullet had just whizzed past our heads. She walked in and closed the door. She said we needed to move fast. She said firing Blue Hollow was the easy part. Replacing them without causing a service gap was the hard part. She proposed a strategy that was aggressive and undeniably clean. She suggested we launch an emergency request for proposal. She said we should invite 3 of Blue Hollow's fiercest competitors to bid on the route. She said we should give them 48 hours to submit their pricing and service guarantees. I looked at her. It was a brilliant move, if we simply handed the contract to another firm quietly. Evan could claim that I had rigged the game. He could claim I gave it to a friend. But if we opened it up to a competitive bidding war, if we forced the market to fight for it, then the decision became mathematically unassailable. It would prove that this was not a personal vendetta. It was a market correction. I told Tessa to do it. I told her to blast the RFP out by noon. I told her to make the criteria strict. I told her to add a specific clause requiring enhanced background checks for all account managers. As Tessa turned to leave, my personal cell phone lit up again. It had been lighting up every 10 minutes for the last hour. It was Evan. He had moved past the stage of threats and had entered the stage of desperate bargaining. I looked at the preview of the messages scrolling down the screen. He wrote that he could fix this. He wrote that it was just a misunderstanding. Then, the bribe started. He wrote that if I reinstated the contract, he would personally cover the cost of the entire wedding. He said he would upgrade the venue. He said he would pay for my dress. I stared at the screen in disbelief. He was trying to buy off a federal trade secret violation with a catering package. A minute later, another message popped up. He offered to pay for a vacation. He said he could get tickets to Bali. He said I looked like I needed a break. He was treating me like a corrupt zoning official he could pay off with a fruit basket. It was insulting. It showed me that he had absolutely no concept of the gravity of what he had done. He thought everything in life was transactional. He thought integrity was just a price point he hadn't met yet. I did not reply. I took a screenshot of the offers. I forwarded them to the legal file Tessa was building. Every bribe was just another nail in his coffin. Then, at 9:30, an email arrived that changed the landscape of the battlefield entirely. It was not from Evan. It was from Marcus Thorne, the vice president of sales at Blue Hollow. The subject line was, "Urgent, Strategic Partnership Resolution." I opened it. It was a panic letter disguised as a corporate olive branch. Marcus was begging for a meeting. He apologized for the administrative errors regarding the data access. He promised that Evan had been reprimanded, but the tone was frantic. And then, in the third paragraph, he made a fatal slip. He wrote that Blue Hollow was currently in the sensitive final stages of a Series B funding round with a major venture capital firm. He wrote that the Heartline contract was the cornerstone asset in their prospectus to the investors. He wrote that losing this revenue stream right now would complicate the valuation metrics and potentially derail the investment. I sat back in my chair. The pieces fell into place with a deafening click. This was not just about Evan's promotion. This was not just about a $2 million commission. Blue Hollow was inflating their value. They were using my client's contract to prop up their company so they could sell a stake to investors. They were presenting themselves as a secure, high-growth partner for Titan Heavy Industries, while simultaneously trying to steal Titan's secrets to sweeten the pot. Evan hadn't just been trying to impress his boss. He had been under orders to get that data because the entire future of his company depended on showing the investors that they had deep integration with the client. If this contract died, the investment died. And if the investment died, Blue Hollow might go under. I realized then that I wasn't just holding a pair of scissors. I was holding a sledgehammer, and I was standing next to a load-bearing wall. I forwarded the email to Tessa with a single note. They are desperate. Proceed with the RFP immediately. My office door opened again, but it wasn't Tessa. It was Brielle. She walked past my receptionist, ignoring the protests. She looked like she hadn't slept in 24 hours. She was wearing the same tracksuit from the diner, but she had thrown a raincoat over it. She was wet, shaking, and pale. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. She held up her phone. She said, "He lied to me." I stood up and walked around my desk. I guided her to the leather sofa in the corner of the office. I poured her a glass of water from the carafe on the side table. I asked her what happened. She drank the water in one gulp. She looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. She said she had gone home after the diner. She said she had tried to ask Evan about the Chimera project. She said she had tried to ask him what else he had taken from our conversations. She said he exploded. She said she had never seen him like that. He wasn't the charming, polished executive anymore. He was a cornered animal. She said he started screaming that I was ruining everything. He screamed that the wedding was off if the money stopped coming in. And then, he said it. Brielle looked at her hands, her voice trembling. She said, "He looked me in the eye and asked me what good I was if I couldn't even control my own sister." The words hung in the air of my office. Cold and brutal. Control. He didn't ask why she couldn't reason with me. He didn't ask why she couldn't persuade me. He asked why she couldn't control me. Brielle looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. She said, "He told me that the only reason he pushed for the engagement now, this month, was because the investors liked family stability. He said he needed the optics of a wedding to look like a dependable man." She choked on a sob. She said, "He called me an asset. Stella. He didn't call me his fiancé. He called me an underperforming asset." I felt a surge of rage that was so pure it almost blinded me, but I pushed it down. Rage was useless. Action was necessary. I sat down next to her. I took her hand. This time, she didn't pull away. I told her that was the truth I'd been trying to show her. I told her that to men like Evan, and to companies like Blue Hollow, people were not human beings. They were lines on a spreadsheet. I was a revenue stream. She was a marketing prop. I told her that the moment the revenue stream dried up, he stopped pretending the prop had any value. Brielle looked at the empty ring finger on her left hand. She had taken the ring off. She whispered, "You were right, about everything." She asked, "What happens now?" Before I could answer, the intercom on my desk buzzed. It was the head of my legal department, a woman named Karen who had previously worked for the district attorney's office. I stood up and walked to the desk. I pressed the speaker button so Brielle could hear. I said, "Go ahead." Karen's voice was sharp and clipped. She said, "Stella, we have finished the preliminary review of the metadata from the access logs." She said, "It is worse than we thought." She said, "We found a download history. Evan Cole didn't just look at the file names. He managed to download a partial schematic of the turbine cooling system before the firewall kicked him out. I felt the blood drain from my face. Karen continued. She said, "This is no longer a civil contract dispute. This is theft of intellectual property involving defense-adjacent technology." She said, "We have a legal obligation to report this to the authorities. If we don't, Heartline becomes an accessory after the fact." She paused. She said, "Stella, I have the filing ready. If we send this to the client's legal team, they will undoubtedly refer it to the FBI. Evan Cole is looking at federal charges." She asked, "Do you want me to proceed?" I looked at Brielle. She was sitting on the sofa, listening. She heard every word. She heard that her ex-fiancé was not just a jerk, but a criminal. She heard that the man she almost married was about to be the subject of a federal investigation. She looked at me. Her eyes were filled with pain, but there was no hesitation in them. She gave me a small, sad nod. I looked back at the phone. I thought about the engagement party. I thought about the bribes. I thought about the way he had looked at my sister and called her an asset. I spoke clearly. I said, "Proceed." "Karen," I said, "we follow the law, we protect the client, and we protect this company." I said, "Send the file." I ended the call. The room was silent. Brielle stood up. She walked over to the window and looked out at the city. She said, "He really thought he could buy you with a vacation to Bali." I stood next to her. I said, "He thought everyone was for sale." I looked at the skyline. Somewhere out there, Evan Cole was probably still trying to salvage his investor meeting. He probably thought he could still talk his way out of this. He didn't know that the email had already been sent. He didn't know that the gears of the justice system had just started to turn. He had wanted to be a big shot. He had wanted to play with the heavy hitters. Well, he was about to find out that the heavy hitters didn't play. They crushed. The request for proposal process had moved with the speed and violence of a summer storm. By Thursday morning, 48 hours after I initiated the emergency protocol, the dust had settled. I sat in my office with Tessa Lane. The mood was not celebratory, but it was grimly satisfied. We had invited 3 competitors to bid on the route that Blue Hollow had vacated. We expected them to take a week. They had replied in 24 hours. It turned out that the logistics market in North Carolina was small, and everyone was hungry for a contract with a Tier 1 manufacturer. We had selected a winner, a firm called Apex Logistics. They were older, boring, and impeccably solvent. Their safety rating was spotless. Their bid came in with a price structure that was transparent and fair, but it was their cover letter that had caught my attention. The vice president of Apex had called me personally to thank me for the opportunity. During that call, he had dropped a piece of information that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He told me that Apex had bid on this same route 18 months ago. He told me they had lost to Blue Hollow. He said he had never understood how Blue Hollow won, because the numbers did not make sense. He told me that Blue Hollow's winning bid back then was 20% below the market cost of fuel and labor. He said, "Stella, at that price, they were losing money on every single mile. No one drives a truck for free. We assumed they had a secret fuel hedge or a magic wand." I looked at the finalized contract for Apex sitting on my desk. The numbers were realistic. They included a healthy profit margin. I realized then what Evan Cole and his company had done. It is a tactic known as predatory pricing. You bid dangerously low to win the contract and get your foot in the door. You accept the financial loss as the cost of entry. Why? Because once you are inside the castle, you can steal the silver. Blue Hollow had not been trying to make a profit on shipping crates. They were never a logistics company. They were a data extraction operation disguised as a trucking firm. They took the loss on the transport so they could get access to the vendor portal, and from there, try to jump the firewall to the Chimera project. The $2 million contract was just the cover charge. The real money was in the trade secrets they were trying to steal. I looked at Tessa. I told her to add this to the file. I told her to draft a supplementary report for the client's compliance officer. I told her to label it Evidence of Predatory Entry Strategy. I told her we were not just dealing with a thief. We were dealing with a corporate parasite. Tessa nodded. She looked tired, but focused. She took the file and left the room. My phone rang. It was the landline this time. I checked the caller ID. It was my mother. I debated letting it go to voicemail. I knew exactly what she was going to say. She had likely heard from Evan, or perhaps Brielle had finally stopped protecting him and told her the truth. But avoiding Diane Turner only made her louder. I picked up the receiver. I said, "Good morning, Mother." Her voice was tight. It was the voice of a woman who was trying to maintain control of a ship that had already hit the iceberg. She did not scream this time. She spoke with a strained, terrifying calmness. She said, "Stella, I just got off the phone with Evan's mother." She said, "Apparently there are rumors that Evan is being investigated. Not just fired, but investigated." I said, "Those are not rumors." She made a sharp intake of breath. She said, "Stella, you have to stop this. You have made your point. You showed everyone you are powerful. You showed everyone you are the boss. Congratulations," she said. "But this is going too far. You are going to give the boy a criminal record. You are going to ruin his life over a misunderstanding." She switched to her favorite weapon, shame. She said, "Think about the family name. Think about Brielle. If her fiancé goes to jail, who will marry her? She is 31 years old. You are destroying her chances." I felt a cold, dull ache in my chest. Even now, facing federal charges, my mother's primary concern was not ethics. It was not the law. It was Brielle's marketability as a bride. I told her that I was not the one who broke the law. I told her that I was not the one who instructed my daughter to act as a corporate spy. I said, "You want to talk about ruining lives? You taught Brielle that her value was in her ability to fetch information for a man. You taught her that lying was acceptable if it helped the right people." My mother interrupted. She said, "I was trying to help them build a future." I said, "You built a house of cards on a foundation of fraud. And now the wind is blowing." I said, "I cannot stop this. Mom, I handed the file to the client yesterday. It is out of my hands. It is with the lawyers now." My mother started to cry. But this time, I heard something else in her voice. It was not manipulation. It was fear. She was finally realizing that her little game of social climbing had walked her family off a cliff. She said, "What are we going to do about the engagement party?" I almost laughed. The absurdity of it was suffocating. I said, "Mom, I think you should probably call the caterer and ask for a refund." I hung up the phone. I sat there for a moment, listening to the hum of the office. The silence was broken by the intercom. Sarah, my receptionist, spoke. Her voice was tense. She said, "Stella, Mr. Cole is here again." I frowned. I had banned him from the building. Sarah continued. She said, "He is with a security guard. He is refusing to leave until he speaks to you. He is causing a scene in the lobby. He says he has new information." I looked at the clock. It was 11. I pressed the button. I told Sarah to bring him up, but I gave her strict instructions. I told her to bring him to conference room A, the one with the camera recording system. I told her to have our head of security stand outside the door, and I told her to page Tessa and our legal counsel. Karen, I was not meeting him alone, never again. 10 minutes later, I walked into the conference room. Evan was sitting at the far end of the long table. He looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot. He had the desperate, jittery energy of a man who had not slept in 2 days. Tessa and Karen were already seated on my side of the table, flanked by notepads and recording devices. When I entered, Evan stood up. He tried to compose himself, tried to summon the ghost of his old arrogance, but it flickered and died. He said, "Stella, thank you." I did not sit down. I stood at the head of the table. I told him he had 5 minutes. I told him that everything in this room was being recorded for legal purposes. Evan nodded quickly. He licked his lips. He said, "Look, I know what it looks like. I know about the logs. I know about the download history." He looked at Karen, then back at me. He said, "But you have to understand, I was under pressure. My boss, Marcus, he told me that if I didn't get that data, the company would fold. He said my job was on the line. He was trying to plea bargain with me. He was trying to frame himself as a victim of toxic management. I asked him if he thought following orders was a valid defense for industrial espionage. He flinched. He said, "No, of course not. But I didn't use the data. I just wanted to have it, just in case." Then, he played his final card. The card that would destroy whatever was left of his relationship with my sister. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. He said, "And honestly, Stella, this is partly Brielle's fault." The room went dead silent. I saw Tessa's pen stop moving. I asked him to clarify that statement. Evan spread his hands. He said, "Brielle, she kept telling me it was okay. She said you wouldn't mind. She said you were just her sister. That you were soft. She said I could work you." He chuckled nervously, a sound that made my skin crawl. He said, "If she hadn't made you sound so manageable, I never would have tried it. She gave me the green light. She told me you were desperate for family approval. She said I could get whatever I wanted if I just flattered you a little." I stared at him. He was not just a criminal. He was a coward. He was willing to blame the woman he claimed to love, the woman who had cried for him, the woman who had defied me for him. He was willing to paint her as the mastermind to save his own skin. I did not say anything. I simply looked toward the door connecting the conference room to my private office. I said, "Did you hear that?" Evan turned around, confused. The door opened. Brielle walked out. She had been in my office the whole time. I had brought her in through the back entrance an hour ago. I wanted her to see the evidence of the predatory pricing. I wanted her to understand the business side of the betrayal. But I had not expected this. I had not expected Evan to hand her the truth on a silver platter. Brielle stood there. She was wearing a simple sweater and jeans. She looked stripped down, raw. Evan's face went white. He stammered. He said, "Brielle, I didn't know you were—" Brielle looked at him. There were no tears this time. The tears were gone. In their place was a look of absolute, freezing clarity. She said, "You told me you loved me because I understood you." She walked closer to the table. She did not look at me. She looked only at him. She said, "You told me that we were a team. You told me that Stella was the problem." She paused, her voice shaking with repressed rage. She said, "But you just told her that I was the problem. You just tried to trade me for a plea deal." Evan stood up, reaching out a hand. He said, "Babe, no, that's not what I meant. I was just trying to explain the context." Brielle cut him off. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. She said, "You are a liar. Evan," she said, "you lied about the promotion. You lied about the contract. You lied about your company. And you lied about loving me." She looked down at her left hand, which was bare. She said, "I was just a networking tool to you. I was just the way you got into my sister's database." Evan's face twisted. The mask fell off completely. The panic turned into nastiness. He sneered at her. He said, "Oh, stop the drama. Brielle, you were happy enough to play along when you thought it came with a country club membership. You were happy enough to dig for dirt when you thought it would buy you a bigger house." He pointed a finger at her. He said, "Do not act like you are innocent. You wanted the lifestyle just as much as I did. You were just too stupid to understand what it cost." I stepped forward. I placed my hands on the table. I said, "That is enough." I looked at Evan. I said, "The meeting is over." I said, "You have admitted to the unauthorized access. You have admitted to the coercion, and you have admitted that your intent was malicious. It is all on tape." I signaled to the security guard standing outside the glass door. I said, "Get out of my building." Evan looked around the room. He saw the recorder. He saw the lawyer. He saw the security guard. And he saw Brielle, looking at him like he was a stranger she wished she had never met. He grabbed his briefcase. He did not say another word. He turned and walked out, brushing past the guard. The door closed behind him. The silence in the room was heavy. Brielle stood there, staring at the empty chair where he had sat. Tessa and Karen quietly gathered their things and left the room, giving us space. I walked over to my sister. I did not hug her immediately. I waited. Brielle took a deep breath. She looked at me. She said, "I postponed the party." I nodded. I said, "I know." She said, "Mom is going to be furious." I said, "Mom will survive." Brielle looked at the door where Evan had exited. She said, "He called me stupid." I shook my head. I said, "You were not stupid. You were trustful. There is a difference," I said. "But now you know." Brielle looked at me. Her eyes were clear. She said, "He wasn't the successful one. Was he?" She said, "All this time, I thought he was the one carrying the weight. I thought he was the big deal. But he was just a fraud in a leased BMW." She looked around my office. She looked at the awards on the shelf. She looked at the view of the city. She looked at the staff working outside the glass walls. My staff, my company, my empire. She said, "You were the successful one, and we treated you like the help." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The truth was finally sitting in the room with us, undeniable and solid. Brielle sat down in one of the chairs. She looked exhausted. She said, "I don't know what to do. Stella, I don't have a fiancé. I don't have a plan. I probably don't have a relationship with Mom after this." I walked over to the window. I looked out at the city. The rain had cleared, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. I said, "You have one thing you didn't have yesterday." "Brielle." She asked, "What?" I turned back to her. I said, "You have your dignity," I said, "and you have a sister who knows a really good lawyer." The intercom buzzed again. It was Karen. She said, "Stella, sorry to interrupt, but I just got a call from the client's legal team." She said, "They have reviewed the file. They have reviewed the confession we just sent over." She paused. She said, "They are pressing charges. The FBI is on their way to Blue Hollow's offices right now to seize their servers." I looked at Brielle. I said, "You might want to turn off your phone. It is about to get very loud." The bomb had finally exploded, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one standing in the blast zone. I was the one watching from the control tower. The letter from Titan Heavy Industries arrived on Friday morning. It was not an email. It was a physical document, delivered by a courier in a sealed envelope, printed on paper so thick it felt like cardstock. I sat in my office with Tessa Lane. We did not speak as I opened it. The sound of the paper tearing was the only noise in the room. I read the letter out loud. I read that the internal compliance review conducted by Titan Heavy Industries had concluded that Blue Hollow Freight Partners had engaged in a systematic attempt to breach proprietary data protocols. I read that the violation was classified as a Level 1 security threat. I read the sentence that ended Evan Cole's career. The letter stated that Blue Hollow Freight Partners was hereby debarred from any future contracts with Titan Heavy Industries or its subsidiaries. It stated that this ban extended to all current active routes. It was not just the $2 million contract that was gone. Titan was canceling everything. They were scrubbing Blue Hollow from their entire vendor list. It was a total excommunication. I looked up at Tessa. I told her that it was done. I told her that Evan had tried to steal a single apple, and in the process, he had burned down the entire orchard. By noon, the news had hit the local business wire. The headline was dry, but to anyone in the industry, it was an obituary. Blue Hollow Freight Partners loses key manufacturing logistics account amidst compliance probe. My phone did not ring with threats from Evan. There were no more bribes. There were no more offers of trips to Bali. I learned later from a contact in HR at Blue Hollow that Marcus Thorne, the vice president who had pushed Evan to get the data, had tried to save himself. He had fired Evan at 10:30 in the morning. He had Evan escorted from the building by security. He had stripped him of his company phone, his laptop, and his access badge. Evan Cole, the man who wanted to be a director, the man who wanted to impress the partners from Atlanta, had walked out into the parking lot with nothing but a cardboard box and a looming federal indictment. The fast track to the executive suite had turned out to be a trap door. At 2 p.m, my mother called. I looked at the screen. I felt a strange sense of detachment. The anger I had felt earlier in the week had cooled into something like pity. She was a woman who had bet her emotional retirement on a horse that had just broken its leg. I answered the phone. I said, "Hello, Mom." I expected tears. I expected accusations. I expected her to tell me that I was cruel, but the voice on the other end was quiet. It was small. She asked if it was true. She asked if Evan had really been fired. I told her yes. I told her that he had been terminated for cause and was facing legal action. There was a long silence on the line. It was the silence of a worldview shattering. Then, she asked a question she had never asked me in 34 years. She asked, "Stella, did you do this?" I corrected her. I said, "I did not fire him." "Mom, I reported a violation. The consequences were automatic." She hesitated. I could hear her breathing on the other end. She asked, "But how did you have the power to do that?" She said, We thought you just handled paperwork. We thought you were just getting by." She paused. She asked, "Did you build all of this by yourself?" She asked the question with a mixture of confusion and genuine awe. She was trying to reconcile the daughter she ignored with the woman who had just brought down a corporate vice president with a single email. I looked around my office. I looked at the view of the skyline. I looked at the team working outside my glass walls. I gave her the honest answer. I did not brag. I did not shout. I just spoke the truth. I told her that yes, I had built it myself. I told her that for years, while she was praising my brother for his bonus checks and praising Brielle for her social calendar. I was working 18 hours a day. I told her that their neglect was actually the secret to my success. I said, "You never asked me what I did. Mom, you never checked my homework. You never offered to introduce me to anyone. You were so busy being ashamed of me that you left me completely alone." I said, "That was the greatest gift you could have given me." I said, "I learned how to value myself because I knew you never would. I learned how to build something that did not require your permission or your approval." I told her that Heartline Contract Systems was not built on family connections. It was built on the fact that I was the only person in the room who read the fine print. My mother did not say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears, but they were not the manipulative tears of before. They were the tears of regret. She said, "I didn't know." I told her I knew she didn't know. I told her that she should probably check on Brielle. I hung up the phone. I did not need her apology. I had my own validation. It was framed on the wall, and it was written in the ink of every contract I signed. An hour later, my receptionist told me that my sister was in the lobby. I told her to send her back. Brielle walked into my office. She looked different than she had yesterday. The tracksuit was gone. She was wearing a simple blouse and slacks. She was not wearing the engagement ring. She did not look like a girl trying to catch a rich husband. She looked like a woman who had just survived a car crash. She stood in front of my desk. She did not sit down. She said, "I am not here to ask for the contract back." I nodded. I said, "Good, because that is impossible." She said, "I am not here to defend him." She took a breath. She said, "I went to his apartment to get my things. He was drunk. He was blaming everyone. He blamed you. He blamed his boss. He blamed the economy." She looked at me. She said, "He never once took responsibility." She said, I looked at him, and I realized that I had spent 3 years trying to mold myself into the perfect accessory for a man who was empty inside. She stepped closer to the desk. She said, "I am sorry. Stella." She said, "I am not sorry because he got caught. I am sorry because I let him treat you like garbage. I am sorry that I uninvited you. I am sorry that I participated in the spying." She said, "I wanted to be part of the successful family so bad that I forgot who my actual family was." I looked at her. I saw the sincerity in her eyes. It was real. The illusion had been burned away, and what was left was my sister. But I was a CEO, and I knew that forgiveness without boundaries was just an invitation for future betrayal. I stood up. I walked around the desk and stood in front of her. I told her I accepted her apology. I told her I loved her. But then, I set the terms. I told her that from this day forward, there was a wall between us. I said. We can be sisters. We can go to brunch. We can talk about movies. We can talk about boys, I said. But you never ask me about my clients. You never ask me for a job. You never ask me to use my influence to help a friend. I said, my business is off limits. If you ever try to leverage my name for social status again, if you ever try to mine me for information again, I will cut you off, and next time, I will not come back. I asked her if we were clear. Brielle nodded. She wiped a tear from her cheek. She said, we are clear. She said, I don't want to use you. Stella, I just want to know you. I smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine. I said, that is a good start. Just then, my computer chimed with a priority email notification. I glanced at the screen. It was from Henderson, the security chief at Titan Heavy Industries. I walked over to the desk and opened it. The subject line was, New Scope of Work, Compliance Audit Vendor Management. I read the email. Henderson wrote that Titan had been impressed by the ruthless integrity Heartline had demonstrated during the breach. He wrote that most vendors would have tried to cover it up to save a family relationship. He wrote that my willingness to self-report a conflict of interest and decapitate a threat, even when it involved my own sister's fiancé, showed a level of risk management they rarely saw. He wrote that Titan was terminating their contract with their current national compliance auditor. He asked if Heartline Contract Systems would be interested in taking over the entire North American portfolio. I scrolled down to the proposed fee structure. The base retainer was $3,500,000 a year. It was almost double the size of the contract Evan had lost. It was the kind of contract that moved a firm from successful to institution. I felt a rush of adrenaline. It was better than champagne. It was better than any party. I looked at Brielle. I told her that honesty pays. I told her that I just landed a contract worth $3.5 million. Brielle's eyes went wide. She gasped. She said, $3.5 million? I nodded. I said, because I refuse to compromise. Brielle smiled. It was a sad smile, but there was pride in it too. She said, Evan lost $2 million because he was a crook. You gained $3 million because you were honest. She said, I think that is what they call poetic justice. I told her she could call it whatever she wanted. I called it business. I told her she should go. I told her I had work to do. Brielle nodded. She turned to leave. She stopped at the door. She said, I am going to see him one last time, tonight. To give him the ring back, I asked her if she wanted me to come with her. She shook her head. She said, no, I need to do this alone. I need to close the account. That evening, Brielle met Evan at a neutral location. She told me about it later. He was sitting in his car, looking at the steering wheel. He looked broken. When he saw her, he started to beg. He started to talk about second chances. He started to talk about how they could still make it work if they just moved to a different city. Brielle did not argue. She did not yell. She reached into her purse and pulled out the velvet box containing the ring he had bought to show off to his partners, the ring that was bought with money he didn't really have, based on a future he hadn't earned. She placed the box on the dashboard. Evan looked at it. He said, Brielle, don't do this. I did this for us. I wanted to be the man you deserved. Brielle looked at him through the open window. She delivered the line that ended it. She said, Evan, you never wanted to be the man I deserved. You wanted me to be the tool you needed. She said, I am not a tool. I am not an asset. And I am definitely not your networking strategy. She said, goodbye. She walked away. She walked across the parking lot, got into her own car, and drove away. She drove to my apartment. She brought a bottle of cheap wine and a pizza. We sat on my balcony and watched the city lights. We did not talk about business. We did not talk about Titan Heavy Industries. We just sat there. Two sisters who had found each other in the wreckage of a disaster. The engagement was over. The contract was signed. The conflict was resolved. My mother called me one more time that night, just to say goodnight. She didn't mention the party. She didn't mention Evan. She just asked if I was eating enough. It wasn't a perfect ending. My family was still flawed. My mother was still difficult. Brielle was still healing. But as I looked out at the city of Raleigh, with a $3.5 million contract in my inbox and my sister sitting next to me, I knew I had won the only thing that mattered. I had won my own respect, and I had reminded everyone that you never, ever invite a wolf to dinner and expect her to act like a sheep. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Stella and her cold, calculated revenge. If you enjoyed this, please leave a comment down below and let me know where you are listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel. Hit that like button. And if you really want to support the channel, please press the hype button so this video can be heard by even more people. See you in the next story.